Chapter 4 of Campfire Girls in the Allegheny Mountains. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Campfire Girls in the Allegheny Mountains by Stella M. Francis. Chapter 4. Studying the Mystery. Is there any wonder that Marion Stanlock, after reading letter number 2, was seriously in doubt as to whether number 1 was from the Scouts who had promised another surprise for the Camp Fire Girls in the near future? Judge for yourself. Here is number 1. Something doing soon. Look out. Something doing soon. Look out. Something doing soon. Look out. That was all. The second letter read thus: Miss Stanlock, this is to serve you with warning not to take your friends with you to Holly Hill this vacation to work among the poor families of the striking miners. We know that move of yours is inspired by the rankest hypocrisy, that you have no genuine desire to do anything for our starving families. This move of yours, we know, was planned by that villainous father of yours to cloud the big issue of our fight. If you do carry out your plans, some of you are liable to get hurt, and it need not surprise anybody if some of you never get back to Westmoreland alive. Go slow, be careful, look out. Marion was not easily panic-stricken, but it is of the nature of a truism to say that this letter applied the severest test to her nerves. That the writer was in deep earnest she had no reason to doubt. She had read of so many crimes preceded by threatening letters of this sort that the suggestion did not come to her to regard this one lightly. Although there was no common basis for comparing the handwriting of the two missives, one being lettered in Roman capitals and the other in ordinary script, nevertheless, she quickly dismissed the first suspicion that letter number 1 was written by Clifford Long or some other scout of Spring Lake Academy. Both ended with the words "Look out." Plainly, this was a result of carelessness on the part of the writer. Evidently, he had planned to cause her to believe that the two letters were written by different persons, for he had taken the pains of differentiating the superscriptions on the envelopes as well as the contents within. But now the question was, what should she do? It was no more than fair and just for her to inform the girls what they might expect if they attempted to carry out their original plan, but what method should she pursue to convey to them this information? She might go at the matter bluntly and create something of a panic. Then again she might so handle it that the best possible result could be obtained in a quiet and orderly manner. Marion felt in this crisis that a great responsibility rested on her to handle the problem with all the skill and intelligence at her command. She longed for the counsel of an older and more experienced head, but there was none present except Miss Ladd, the guardian of the fire, to whom she might go with her story. The latter, though she came well within the requirements of the National Board to fill the position which she held, was nevertheless a young woman in the sensitive sense of the phrase, and could hardly be expected to give the best of executive advice under the circumstances. Marion realized that it was her duty to exhibit to Miss Ladd the letters she had received, but if she did this at once, the act would amount to turning the whole matter over to her and relinquishing the initiative herself, she reasoned. Marion was naturally aggressive, and she was not favourably impressed with the idea of leaving the affair in the hands of another unless that person were peculiarly fitted to handle it. As she sat studying over the problem, she suddenly became conscious of the presence of another person close beside her, and looking up she saw Helen Nash, with an expression of startled intelligence in her eyes. Apparently her attention had been attracted by the crude drawing of a skull and crossbones at the close of the letter lying open in her lap. "I beg your pardon, Marion," said Helen with an evident effort at self-control. "I didn't mean to intrude. I hope you'll forgive me for something quite unintentional." "Certainly, Helen," Marion replied generously, "and since a chance look has informed you of the nature of these letters, and I want to talk this affair over with somebody, I think I may as well talk it over with you. Let's go down to the other end of the car, where we aren't likely to be disturbed." Accordingly, they moved up to the front of the car, where they took possession of two chairs, and soon were so deeply absorbed in the problem at hand as to excite the wonder and curiosity of the other Camp Fire Girls. Marion handed the two anonymous letters to her friend without introductory remark, and the latter read them. As Marion watched the expression on the reader's face, she was forced to admit to herself that right then, under those seemingly impersonal circumstances, Helen's habitual strangeness of manner was more pronounced than she had ever before known it to be. The girl of impenetrable secrecy read the letters, seemingly with an abstraction amounting almost to inattention, while physically she appeared to shrink from something that to her alone was visible and real. As she finished reading, Helen looked up at her friend, and the gaze of penetrating curiosity that she saw in Marion's eyes caused her to blush with confusion. Unable to meet her friend's gaze steadily, she shifted her eyes toward the most uninteresting part of the car, the floor, and said: "That looks like a dangerous letter. It ought to be turned over to the police as soon as possible." "Both of them, don't you think?" Marion inquired. "Why, I don't see anything in this shorter one. My guess would be that it was written by your cousin or one of his friends." "But do you notice the way they both end? The same words?" Marion insisted. "Yes, I notice that," Helen replied slowly, "but that is such a common, ordinary expression, almost like a, an, or that it doesn't mean much to me here. Where are the letters postmarked?" "Both in Westmoreland." "That's something in favor of your suspicion that both letters were written by the same person," Helen admitted. "Still, it doesn't convince me. You wouldn't expect the Spring Lake boys to mail a letter like the shorter one at Spring Lake, would you? That would stamp its identity right away." "You are sure those letters were written by different persons?" Marion inquired curiously. "I don't think it makes any difference whether they were or not," Helen answered more decisively than she had spoken before. "It is in that skull and crossbones letter that you are most interested. I think you can disregard the other entirely. I would say this, however, that if both were written by one person, you have less to fear than if the shorter one was written by your cousin or one of his friends." "Why?" "Because if one person wrote both of them, he is probably suffering from softening of the brain. But if the person who wrote the longer one did not write the shorter one, there is more likelihood that he means business and will attempt to carry out his threat." "I never realized that you were such a Sherlock Holmes," Marion exclaimed enthusiastically, while the suggestion came to her that perhaps a genius for this sort of thing accounted for her friend's peculiarities. "You ought to be a detective for a department store to catch shoplifters." "Thanks, Marion, for the compliment, but I am not inclined that way." I'd rather do something in this case to keep our vacation plans from ending in trouble." "I was looking for someone who could advise me," Marion said, "and I am now convinced that you are just the person I was looking for. What do you think I ought to do, Helen?" "All the girls ought to know about this letter," Helen replied, "but you can't go to them and blurt out anything so sensational. We must break the news gently, as they say in melodrama. I wish we hadn't come." "So do I," Marion replied, but with just a suggestion of disappointment in her voice. "Not that I am afraid of getting hurt," Helen added hastily, realizing the suspicion of cowardice that might rest against her. "Still, if my advice had been asked, I would have argued against this very dangerous vacation scheme of yours." "Why?" inquired Marion in a tone of disappointment. "Because of the very situation complained of in that skull and crossbones letter. I hope I don't hurt your feelings, Marion, but it is very natural for some of these rough miners to suspect that your plan was cooked up by your father to pull the wool over their eyes, and to regard you as a tool employed by him to put the scheme into operation. Some of the girls' parents raised the objection that there might be danger in a mining district during a strike, but none of them suggested anything of this sort," Marion remarked with a humble anxiety. "I explained to them that there could hardly be any danger even if the strikers should get ugly, as the miners are some distance from where we live and any violence on the part of the miners would surely be committed at the scene of their labours." This seemed to satisfy them. Most of the miners live at the south end of the town or along the electric line running from Hollyhill to the mines. "That doesn't make much difference if the miners once get it into their heads that the girls are being used to put over a confidence game on them," Helen argued authoritatively. "Miners are peculiar people, especially if they are led by radical leaders of aggressive purpose. They believe that they are a badly misused set, turning out the wealth of the wealthy, who repay them by holding them in contempt, keeping their wages down to a minimum, and pressing them into social and political subjection." "Where did you learn all that, Helen?" Marion asked wonderingly. "You are not even studying sociology at school. You talk like a person of experience." "My father was a miner," Helen began, then she stopped, and Marion saw from the expression in her eyes and the twitch of her mouth that a big lump in her throat had interrupted her explanation. She seemed to be making an effort to continue, but was unable to do so. "Never mind, Helen," said Marion, taking her hand tenderly in her own. "I am more convinced than ever that I found just the right person to advise me when I laid this matter before you. We will try to work this problem out together. Meanwhile, we must take Miss Ladd into our confidence. Why, here she is now." Chapter 4